Snow drifted in long, lonesome ribbons across the plains, soft as breath and cold as regret. It settled on the cracked shingles of the Finch homestead, on the bent fence gate that creaked whenever the wind remembered it, on the tiny footprints of two children chasing one another past a sagging barn. Winter had lingered longer than it should have, and Clara Finch knew better than to trust its silence. She split wood in the brittle morning light, each swing of the axe a quiet answer to the world's questions she'd long stopped entertaining. Her dress was threadbare at the elbows, her boots lined with rags, but she moved with the calm precision of a woman who'd learned how to keep going. A curl of hair had fallen from her braid, silver at the temple, though she was barely 30. She wiped her brow with the back of her glove and glanced toward the tree line. Nothing stirred. Not yet. Behind her, Miriam's giggles floated like birdsong, piercing the cold. The girl had Clara's wide-set eyes, though hers still held wonder. She was making angels in the snow, arms flung wide, the hem of her patched skirt damp and frosted. Samuel stood a few paces away, a quiet watcher even in play. He didn't run much anymore. 10 years old and already old in the eyes, like he'd seen too many things a boy shouldn't have. Clara felt that weight in him, in herself. They had made it through worse winters, though barely. The hens had stopped laying, and the last of the salt pork had been scraped clean 2 days ago. Clara told the children stories to distract their stomachs. She whispered to them about green summers and fried apples, about how love used to feel like firelight and warm bread, not just the absence of hunger. She was banking the fire when Samuel came to the door, breathless, cheeks red from wind. He hesitated, glancing behind him as if the words he carried might change the world. "Ma," he said, "there's blood by the creek." Clara stood without asking how he knew. He was not a boy given to exaggeration. The sky was the color of faded denim as they followed the tracks, deep, dragging footprints half filled with snow, smears of red bright against the white. At the edge of the woods, they found him. He lay crumpled at the base of a cedar, wrapped in a torn buffalo robe. His skin was darker than any man Samuel or Miriam had seen in person, his hair braided and matted with ice. One hand clutched a broken spear, the other pressed to a wound at his ribs. His breath came shallow, misting the air with effort. Miriam took Clara's hand, silent for once. Samuel stood with fists balled, not from fear, but confusion. Clara stepped closer, slow, as if approaching a frightened animal. She knelt beside him, felt the heat of his fever through the cold. His eyes fluttered open, dark, unreadable, full of pain. She touched his forehead. His skin burned beneath her glove. "Lakota," she murmured. They'd told stories in town, all of them hard and half-true. About raids, about vengeance, about keeping distance. But this wasn't a warrior come to burn. This was a man dying in the snow, not 20 yards from her doorstep. "You can't leave him," Miriam whispered. Clara looked at her daughter, surprised at the firmness in her voice. She didn't answer. Instead, she pulled the robe tighter around the man's shoulders and motioned for Samuel. "Help me lift him," she said. He was heavy, but not solid. Starved, likely. Fever thin. They dragged him across the snow, through the field, back to the cabin where warmth and risk waited in equal measure. Inside, Clara laid him on the cot near the stove, pushing aside her mending basket. The fire hissed in protest as she stoked it higher, boiling water with trembling hands. Miriam stood at her mother's elbow, ready with cloths. Samuel fetched the jar of lard, the willow bark, the needle. They had done this before for strangers, for travelers. But never someone like him. Clara cut away his shirt, revealing the wound. Deep angry. Could be infection, could be worse. She cleaned it, whispered apologies under her breath, like prayer. The man winced, but did not wake. Miriam brushed snow from his hair with a gentleness that made Clara pause. "You think he'll live?" Samuel asked. "I don't know," Clara answered, "but I won't let him die cold." That night, she sat by his bedside, listening to the wind claw at the windows. The children slept curled beneath quilts, their dreams untouched by the storm outside. Clara kept her vigil, watching the slow rise and fall of the stranger's chest. In the lamplight, he looked younger than she'd thought, though hardship aged every man on the frontier. She didn't know what the town would say. Didn't much care. They hadn't come when her husband died in the mine collapse. They hadn't brought soup when she miscarried the third time. They hadn't defended her when Silas Finch stood at her door 6 weeks after the funeral, saying a woman alone should remarry quick or expect no kindness. She had chosen silence over submission. The town had chosen to forget her. But Clara remembered. She remembered the sting of being alone. The way people looked through you like you were already gone. She saw that same look now on the face of the man in her home. At dawn, the fever broke. She felt it first in the stillness. No more shivering, no labored breath. When she touched his skin, it was cool, damp with sweat. His eyes opened, slower this time. He looked at her, truly looked. Not with fear, not with demand. Just recognition. "You're safe," she said softly. "You're not alone." His lips parted, but he spoke in Lakota, words she did not understand. Still, his voice was low, roughened by thirst, shaped by something ancient and aching. She gave him water. He drank it without breaking eye contact. "Sleep," she said. "You'll need strength come morning." He nodded once and closed his eyes. Later, as she spooned thin broth into bowls, Samuel watched her with a quiet she couldn't name. He didn't ask questions, not yet. But something in his gaze had changed. "You think he's dangerous?" he finally said. Clara looked out the window. Snow still falling. Always falling. "Everything out here is dangerous," she said. "So is kindness." They ate in silence. The wind outside softened. In the corner, the stranger breathed evenly. Clara sat by the fire and wrapped her shawl tighter. She should have been afraid. She wasn't. Not of him. There was something in his presence that spoke to a deeper truth, one she couldn't name, only feel. A quietness. A strength not of muscle, but of stillness. Like the trees that survive the storm by bending, not breaking. She glanced toward the cot and found him watching her again. No words passed between them. None were needed. It would not be easy, she knew. The town would whisper. Men like Silas would come. But for the first time in many winters, Clara felt something more than survival stir in her chest. Not hope, exactly, but the first shape of it, like the soft edge of a thaw beneath layers of ash and snow. The storm passed in the night, leaving a fragile stillness behind. Ice clung to the eaves like crystal lace, and the trees stood wrapped in silence, as if the land itself were holding its breath. Clara moved through the morning with the same quiet, carrying a bucket of water in one hand and a basin of boiled cloth in the other. Inside the cabin, the Lakota man slept, his chest rising steady now, his wound stitched and cleaned. She hadn't asked for his name. She didn't know if she was allowed. Samuel had begun sharpening his old knife again, a habit he'd picked up from his father and never quite put down. He sat near the window, one eye on the man, one on the field still buried under white. Miriam was humming to herself, twirling a strip of ribbon through her fingers as she drew pictures in the frost on the glass. When the man stirred, Clara went to him. He blinked slowly, his face registering the warmth, the cot, the roof above him. He tried to sit, but winced. Clara reached out a steadying hand. "You're safe here," she said gently. He didn't answer with words. Instead, he nodded once, small, respectful. Later, she found him in the barn, sitting against a bale of hay, weak but upright. He'd refused the cot after that first night, taking up space only where he felt he belonged. She watched as he mended a broken hinge on the barn door, the movement slow but practiced. His fingers were careful, knowing. Samuel stood nearby, watching silently, absorbing every motion like scripture. That evening, as the wind returned with a growl in its throat, Clara ladled stew into chipped bowls and handed them to the children. The man did not come in until she called. Even then, he stood by the door, refusing to cross the threshold without her gesture. She nodded, and he stepped inside. They ate together, the four of them. No one spoke at first. The fire cracked in the hearth, shadows dancing like old ghosts on the walls. Miriam was the first to speak. "What's your name?" The man looked at her, then at Clara. "You don't have to answer," Clara said softly. He considered, then replied, voice low, as if unused to speaking aloud. Tahu. Miriam smiled. I like it. He looked down, humbled. Clara watched him carefully. Not for danger. She'd seen danger before and knew its shape. No, she watched for the reasons a soul becomes quiet. She recognized that silence. Days passed like water over stone. Tahu remained, moving slowly through recovery. Each morning he worked, not because he was asked, but because he could not bear idleness. He repaired the shutter, split wood when his strength returned, and once she caught him sanding a broken toy of Samuel's, whittling it smooth again. He never explained himself. He simply gave. The children were drawn to him, with a cautious curiosity only the very young possess. Miriam sat near him often, chattering about clouds and birds and imaginary beasts. He answered her with nods, sometimes gestures. Samuel stayed more distant, but his eyes followed Tahu like a student watching a teacher he hadn't yet decided to trust. The town came back to Clara in the form of boot prints outside the fence. Someone had come up the road and left again without knocking. She knew what it meant. They'd heard, or sensed, or simply wanted to find fault in her again. A few days later, the preacher came. Reverend Bancroft was not an unkind man, but he carried righteousness like a badge pressed into flesh. Clara opened the door before he knocked. Miss Finch, he said, hat clutched in his hands. Reverend, she answered, stepping aside only slightly. I heard a troubling tale. About a visitor in your home. Her face remained still. I've had many visitors this winter. He cleared his throat, eyes shifting beyond her to where Samuel was chopping wood, Tahu visible in the barn shadow. Some in town are concerned. This man, he's not one of us. Clara met his gaze without flinching. He bled like one of us. You don't know what he's done. I know what he didn't do. He didn't leave my children to starve. He didn't watch my house rot. He didn't preach when he could have helped. Bancroft took a step back, color rising to his cheeks. You've always been a proud woman, Clara. Pride is a dangerous thing. So is silence. He left without blessing the house. She closed the door gently behind him. That evening, Tahu stood by the fire with his back to her, mending one of Samuel's shirts. She stepped beside him, watched the flicker of flame reflected in his eyes. She could see now the way he carried things. Not just wounds, but memories. A heaviness that came from witnessing too much, from living through things no one speaks of. You don't have to fix everything, she said softly. His voice was almost a whisper. It gives my hands purpose. She nodded, understanding more than she let on. A storm came 2 nights later, the kind that howls like it remembers every sorrow the land has known. They were all trapped inside, the wind shaking the windows, snow piling against the door. Clara lit every lamp. The shadows deepened anyway. She found herself beside Tahu again, sitting near the fire as the children slept curled together. The silence between them was comfortable now, a kind of shared language. He looked up suddenly and spoke, voice quiet. My sister died last winter, burned from her home. Clara turned to him, still. My people call me Tahu. It means fire survivor, but it also means one who remains. That's not always a blessing. She didn't offer empty comfort. Instead, she placed a hand over his, grounding him. His fingers curled slightly around hers, unsure but grateful. Loss is a strange kind of teacher, she said. It teaches you who you are after the world forgets you. They stayed like that for a long time. No words, just breath and warmth. The next morning, Tahu was in the field with Samuel, showing him how to track rabbits by the imprint of their back feet. Clara watched from the porch, Miriam pressed against her side, tiny hands tucked into her shawl. She noticed the way Samuel's shoulders had loosened, how his steps mimicked Tahu's exactly. It wasn't just skill he was learning. It was steadiness, presence. That evening, Clara found a small figure carved from wood on the table. A bird mid-flight, wings outstretched. No note, just the bird. She traced its edges with her fingers and felt something unfurl in her chest, something fragile and unexpected. 2 nights later, trouble came again in the form of Silas Finch. He didn't knock. He walked right up to her porch like he still had a claim to it. Clara stepped out before he could call her name. "You've made yourself quite the scandal," he said, smiling like a man who liked the sound of his own voice. Clara didn't move. "You always thought you were better than the rest of us. Look at you now, letting a savage sleep in your barn, letting your kids call him uncle, I hear." She didn't answer. He stepped closer. "You think he'll stay? You think men like him don't leave, don't bring trouble behind them? Don't you dare play at innocence." She didn't flinch. She simply looked past him. Tahu stood at the edge of the yard, quiet, unmoving. His presence stopped Silas mid-breath. He didn't speak, didn't threaten, just stood, solid, grounded, gaze steady as iron. Something in it made Silas take half a step back. "This ain't over," he muttered, turning on his heel. But it was. Clara could feel it. That night, as she lay beneath the quilt, her body still with exhaustion, she felt something shift inside her. Not love, not yet, but safety. A deep-rooted trust in the man who asked for nothing, gave everything, and watched the world with the eyes of someone who had already endured its worst. She looked over at the fire, saw his silhouette curled near it, and let herself fall asleep. Winter was loosening its grip, not in the trees, not in the soil, but in the heart. And that was where everything began. The days grew longer in ways that had nothing to do with sunlight. Snow still blanketed the fields, but it had softened, losing its sharpness. Icicles no longer hung like knives, but wept in the warmth of each quiet afternoon. In the hush between winter's breath and spring's promise, something delicate began to form between them, a rhythm, a belonging, though neither Clara nor Tahu dared give it a name. Each morning, Tahu rose before the children stirred, his breath frosting in the air as he checked the fence line or refilled the feed troughs. Clara would find him outside, sleeves rolled past his elbows, scars pale against his skin as he worked in silence. He moved through her land like he had always been part of it, respectful, efficient, present. She watched him once from the window, a pot of coffee cooling in her hands, and realized she was no longer waiting for him to leave. The children, once uncertain, had woven him into their days without ceremony. Miriam began to leave drawings on the barn door for him to find, charcoal stick figures, crude birds with wide wings, hearts in the corners. Samuel followed him now with the loyalty of a younger brother, asking questions he never would have dared before. "How do you know where the deer have gone?" "They leave behind silence," Tahu answered. "Is that a joke?" "No," he said. "Silence has shape if you listen." Samuel nodded like he understood, and maybe he did. Clara saw the way her son stood taller, the way he no longer watched the horizon like it owed him something. He had stopped sharpening his knife. He spent his time now smoothing the handle, making it fit his hand better. That was Tahu's way. He didn't fix by force. He taught by being. One afternoon, Clara found a rabbit snare outside the barn, well-crafted, precise. Not hers. Not Samuel's. She followed the line of tracks back to where Tahu stood, teaching Miriam how to tie the knot again. Her daughter's face was pure focus, her tongue peeking from the corner of her mouth. "You're patient with them," Clara said later, when they were alone. "They are not hard to love," he replied, without looking up. She didn't answer, but his words followed her like a quiet echo. That night by lamplight he carved another figure, an elk, its antlers sweeping like frozen branches. He left it on the windowsill. She didn't speak of it, but placed it next to the bird on the mantel. She was beginning to understand the language of his silences. One evening, as the sky bruised into dusk, he told her about his family. Not everything, just a name, a place, a sister lost to fire, a father who taught him to read the trees like scripture. His voice was even, almost detached, but Clara felt the weight behind it. "You were hunted?" she asked quietly. He nodded once. "They burned the winter camp. Said it was retaliation." Clara pressed her fingers against the mug in her hands, trying to ground herself. "I'm sorry." He looked at her then. "You're the first person to say that." She felt her throat close, like something sacred had passed between them. They didn't speak of it again, but something shifted. Not loudly, not suddenly, just the way the wind changes direction without warning, subtle but certain. And still, the world crept closer. Word from town came through a neighbor girl who sold eggs. She'd heard men talking outside the mercantile. Said Clara Finch had taken up with a savage. Said she was letting him teach her children heathen ways. Clara didn't flinch. She just paid for the eggs and sent the girl off with extra sugar. But that night, she looked at her children differently. Not with worry, but with wonder. Because despite the talk, they were thriving. Their laughter no longer sounded like borrowed joy. They were sturdy, steady, blooming in the care of a man who never claimed them, yet showed up each day as if he had nothing else in the world to protect. That week, Clara woke one morning to find the barn roof mended, the porch rail reinforced, and a new shelf built into the pantry, all quiet acts, unasked for, unthanked, yet unmistakably his. "You make yourself useful," she said, watching him stack kindling. He gave the faintest smile. "It's how we show love." She didn't reply, but something in her chest tightened. They were standing close that night, hanging laundry beneath a sky streaked with the first hint of spring. The wind lifted the linen and caught her hair, and for a moment, they turned toward each other. His hand reached to tuck a strand behind her ear, paused, then lowered. The air between them shimmered, not with heat, but with restraint. Clara felt her breath catch, not from longing, but recognition. He saw her. Not as broken, not as some abandoned widow, holding a family together with frayed thread. He saw her strength, her sadness, her stubborn grace, and never once looked away. And yet, nothing passed between them but understanding. The next morning, Samuel asked if Tahu would teach him to ride. Clara watched from the porch as Tahu lifted him onto the old mare's back, calm and precise, correcting his posture with a firm hand on the shoulder. Samuel's grin stretched wide across the horizon. When the boy rode a clean circle around the yard and dismounted with pride, Tahu only nodded. No applause. Just that quiet presence again, enough to make a boy feel worthy without needing to perform. Later, Tahu brought Clara a small bundle wrapped in deer hide, dried berries, willow bark, and a bit of buffalo fat. Medicine. She took it with both hands, more moved than she could say. "You saved me," he said then, voice graveled and low. "No," she replied. "I just didn't let you die. You gave me place. You earned it." He looked at her then, eyes darker than the storm-swept woods. "I want to stay." Clara hesitated. Not from fear, from hope. Before she could answer, the horizon shifted. A rider approached. Dust lifted from hoofbeats. Samuel saw him first and shouted. Tahu stepped in front of the children instinctively, still as stone. It was Silas again. He rode with two others, rifles slung and faces hard with that particular breed of cruelty that wears righteousness like armor. Clara met them at the gate. "Heard you're keeping company with an outlaw," Silas said. "The town has questions." "Tahu is not an outlaw," Clara replied calm. "He's not a citizen either. You want trouble, keep courting it." Tahu didn't speak. He didn't need to. His stillness was warning enough. "We'll be back," Silas spat. "And next time we won't be talking." They rode off, the sound of hooves cracking against the hard-packed road like a threat. That night, Clara didn't sleep. Neither did Tahu. They sat together by the stove, the fire low, the air thick with what might come. "I won't send you away," she said. "Not for them." He turned toward her. "They'll try to break this." She shook her head. "Let them try." In the silence that followed, his hand found hers, not in hunger, not in desperation, but in reverence. She didn't pull away. They sat like that, fingers lightly joined, as the wind bent around the house. The world was closing in, and yet something inside their walls was growing stronger. Not love yet, but the shape of it, the promise. Morning broke pale and brittle, the kind of cold that felt ceremonial, sharp-edged, hollow, as if the land itself knew something was about to shift. Clara stood at the window, her breath fogging the pane. Beyond the glass, the yard lay quiet, rimmed in silver frost. Tahu was already outside, feeding the mare, his figure moving slow and solid through the blue hush. She watched him the way a woman watches something she knows could be taken, grateful, reverent, bracing herself. He hadn't asked again if he could stay. He didn't need to. He stayed through deed, through stillness, through presence. And she, without saying it aloud, had already let him in. Inside the house, Samuel sat at the table sharpening a stick into an arrow. Not because he needed it, but because Tahu had shown him how. Miriam was braiding scraps of cloth for a new rug, humming to herself. Everything about the morning was ordinary, and everything about it was not. The sound came at midday, hoofbeats unmistakable. Clara was in the garden bed, loosening the frozen soil with her hands. Her body stilled before her mind caught up. She looked up and saw them. Silas Finch, 2 other men beside him, another hanging back, 4 horses, 4 rifles. They didn't slow. Tahu stepped from the barn before she could call out, bow already slung over his shoulder, knife strapped to his thigh. He didn't raise his voice, didn't posture. He only stood between the riders and the house, as Clara rose and wiped her hands against her apron. Silas dismounted first, eyes cutting across the yard like a blade. "You were warned," he said, voice tight with pleasure. "But some people don't learn unless they bleed." Clara moved beside Tahu, not behind. She didn't speak yet. She looked to Samuel, who had stepped onto the porch, Miriam close behind him. One child clutching her skirts, one with fire in his eyes. No place for them in this. "Send the children inside," Tahu said quietly, voice low but clear. Samuel hesitated. Clara nodded. "Go. Lock the door. Don't open it till I knock twice." When the children were gone, she faced the men. "There's no law here that says a man can't live quiet," she said. "There's no law at all out here," Silas replied. "Just what men decide they'll tolerate." Tahu's gaze remained fixed on the speaker. His hands didn't twitch. His posture didn't shift. But something coiled in him, deep and watchful. "You come to kill him, then?" Clara said. "For being alive? For not dying where you thought he should?" "He's a threat." "To who?" Silas's face twisted. "You don't know what men like him are capable of." "I know exactly what men like you are capable of," Clara answered. One of the others spat into the dirt. "Step aside," Silas said. Tahu stepped forward instead. "I've taken nothing from you," he said. "I've raised no weapon. I've claimed no land. You come here with fear in your hearts and try to name it justice. But I see what you are." The man to Silas's right lifted his rifle half an inch. That was all. Tahu's hand moved like wind. Arrow notched. Drawn. Silas raised his voice. "You'd fire on a white man?" "I'd protect what I've been given," Tahu said. Clara's voice came like flint. "If you want blood today, you'll have to spill mine too." The wind moved between them, caught in the hollows of old words and worse wounds. Silas laughed, but it cracked at the edges. "This is madness." Tahu's eyes didn't waver. "Then leave it behind." And something in the moment held. The bow, the guns, the rising tension in the lungs of every man present. But the thing about violence is that it's often less about cause than timing. The fourth man, young and itching to prove himself, twitched. His rifle lifted. It never fired. Tahu's arrow thudded into the frozen ground at the man's feet before the trigger pulled. Clara didn't flinch. Silas stared at the arrow, then at Tahu, then at Clara. And he knew, not that he'd lost, but that he'd never been the strongest thing in this yard. Not against silence, not against love, not against a woman who'd weathered death and disgrace and still stood taller than any of them. Without another word, he turned. The others followed. No honor in a fight they weren't sure they could win. Hoofbeats faded into the distance. Not triumph, but retreat. Tahu exhaled like he hadn't in days. Clara turned toward him. "I told you I wouldn't send you away," she said. He looked at her, brow furrowed like he still didn't understand how someone could be so certain. "Even if it costs you everything." "It's already cost me everything," she said. "Now I get to choose what I build from the ashes." She reached out then, not shyly, not urgently, but with the quiet gravity of someone making a promise. Her fingers touched his. He didn't take her hand. He let her have it. Let her decide. That night, Clara brought out her late husband's coat. She had kept it folded at the bottom of a chest for years, not out of devotion, but habit. She shook it out, brushed off the dust, and handed it to Tahu. He held it as if it were sacred. "You sure? He won't be needing it," she said. "But someone will." They sat outside that night under a sky dusted with stars. The cold light of it blew on their skin. The children slept inside. The wind was quiet. No more danger on the road. At least not tonight. "Will you stay?" she asked. "I already have," he said. She nodded because she knew. Home wasn't where you started. It was where someone made space for your pain, where your silence didn't scare them, where you were allowed to become again. Spring came slow, with mud and birdsong. Tahu taught Samuel to fish with patience and no praise, which mattered more. He showed Miriam how to press flowers between book pages, to watch them fade into paper like soft secrets. He built shelves. He mended fences. He didn't take space. He created it. Clara planted corn. She wrote again in her old journal, about light, about mercy, about the fire that hadn't destroyed her, only revealed what had survived. One evening, Samuel turned to Tahu and asked, "What are we to you?" Tahu thought for a long time. "You are what comes after the storm," he said. Clara didn't cry when she heard it, but something inside her, tightly wrapped and long buried, breathed again. Later that summer, a rider came up the road, a friend from the next town, asking for help fixing a collapsed roof. Tahu offered to go. He left for 4 days. Clara waited with still hands and an unmoving heart, because she knew he'd come back. When he did, dust on his boots and a hawk feather in his satchel, he handed her a pouch of seeds. "Sweet corn," he said. She smiled and took it. The prairie bloomed wild that year. Bees moved slow through lavender. The creek ran clear again. One evening, as the sun spilled gold across the field and the children chased fireflies, Tahu stood beside her on the porch, their hands brushing as they watched the sky darken. She turned to him and said the only words that ever really needed saying, "You're home." And he answered without speaking. The fire inside her, the one life had tried to drown, bury, name unworthy, burned warm and steady now. Not wild, not consuming, but sure, like frost melting under a quiet sun. That's the thing about the West. It remembers everything. It doesn't forgive quickly, but it watches. And when it sees something true, something born not of passion, but of persistence, it blesses it in its own way. Not loudly, just with roots and bloom.